First, I want to highlight or want to emphasize that PSP is all for fiscal prudence. However, I think the PM and Finance Minister and the government has always been taking the attitude that the surpluses, the more the merrier. So I want to say is that surpluses are not always the more the merrier. There must be a balance. So my first question is, the leader of opposition has pointed out that this term of government will have a budget surplus of $14 billion. So I'd like to ask the PM, is the government aiming to run a balanced budget over its term, or as much surpluses as possible? Because we are of the view that surpluses coming from over-taxation and overcharging are the drivers of structural inflation in Singapore. My second question, does the government believe that there's still a need to put back into the reserves for the $40 billion we spent on COVID-19? Because we all know from the statistics, from the data provided by MAS, that we have already accumulated more than $300 billion more in official foreign reserves over the last few years. And some of this has been transferred to the GIC already. So these are the two questions for the budget structure.
You can move to your next three questions.
Okay. So my next three questions is on the NIRC. The government has repeatedly highlighted that NIRC contributes 20% of the budget resources, implying that this money was spent on the current generation of Singaporeans. To determine whether this is actually the case, I would like to ask the following questions. 1. Can the PM confirm that indeed, on the average, budget resources equivalent to about 80% of the NIRC every year are being transferred to endowment and trust funds, which will not all be spent in the allocated year, but reported as an expenditure in that year? 2. What is the total assets under the funds as of today? I think it's about $70 or $80 billion, but I would like the PM to confirm. In other words, these are the NIRC that has been allocated to the budgets over the last few years, not spent, and still remaining in the endowment and trust funds. Third question. We already have a single framework which can be used to fund important infrastructure like Changi Airport and coastal protection at a much lower cost to the people than raising revenue from GST hikes or COE. So can the government re-examine the need to divert so much resources from the NIRC to endowment and trust funds so that we can redirect these budget resources to fund social spending increases, or to relook at the need for the hike in GST and property tax increases? My last category speaker is on public housing. 4 questions. The PSP has presented the Affordable Home Scheme and Millennial Apartment Scheme as viable solutions to our current housing problems. The government has been criticizing our ideas without much basis because it does not seem to have done research on them. And at the same time, the government is not offering enough explanation as to how it is going to solve the ongoing problems that we are already experiencing today. First question, what is the latest update on the solution for the least decay problem? Second question, can I ask the PM whether the government has a better solution than AHS to the least decay problem, which threatens Singaporeans' retirement security because their retirement funds are tied to the value of their flat, which may soon decay for those living in older flats? 3, how is the government going to ensure that the BTO price will stay below $1 million as the land costs continue to increase in line with property price increases? 4, what safeguards do the government have in place if the resale market price collapses in the near future because of the increase in supply from the ramping up of the BTO supply in recent years? And sorry, Speaker, since you say I should ask one more question, as I was going through, there's one more question I want to ask. So this is actually the 10th question. I also like to chip in on the point raised by Leader of Opposition on turbocharging inflation due to GST. I think the information provided by PM is not enough to describe the situation because, one, the ground inflation is actually much more than what is reflected in the statistic. I have lived in Singapore for more than 60 years, and even my personal experience, including the experience in the 70s when I accompanied my mother to go to the community center to buy cheap rice from NTUC. The recent few years, really, I can feel the prices are just going leapfrogging, especially cooked food. Okay, so the ground inflation is different. I think the word turbocharging is not too far from the truth. Secondly, the statistical inflation data that PM has quoted, around 6% in 2022, but when GST was increased, the inflation actually come down, the reported inflation. 2023, 4% around, and 2024, around 3%. But he is an economist, I'm an economist. We know there's such a thing as anticipatory behavior. A lot of the merchants are already raising prices in 2022. So the 6% is a better reflection that people are anticipating that GST is coming. Okay, so combined, anyway, all 3 years we have, more than double-digit increases in inflation. That tells the story better, I think.
First, on the budget structure, I think Mr. Leong has mischaracterized the government's position. It's not the bigger the surplus, the merrier. We don't just look at it from that point of view. We adopt a responsible and fiscal prudent approach in budgeting. We are prepared to spend more if there are good ideas. As I said, the issue is not about spending more. The issue is about getting the policies right and making the right decisions to support Singaporeans. And if this entails more spending, we will. As you have seen in our social development spending, it is rising, and I fully expect it to rise further. The issue at hand is really about the approach towards thinking about budgeting. Our approach is one where we recognize that there are fiscal rules. And if there are fiscal rules, let's respect the rules. Let's not just keep thinking about changing the rules the first time we run into trouble and need more money. Let's stay disciplined, operate within these fiscal rules, and if we need more money, we raise the revenues to support and cover the additional spending needs. That's the fundamental approach that we adopt. I think the PSP may have a different approach, and they are fine to have a different approach, but as I say, when we have a care about what you want and how you want to manage our country's finances, you may think it's not a big deal, just spend more, disregard the rules, but step by step, these are sure ways to weaken Singapore fiscally, and when that happens, it's Singaporeans who suffer. The talk about whether we will put back into reserves, I thought I made that clear in my speech. We will not be putting back into the reserves. We will not be able to because we do not expect structural surpluses. We expect to run balanced budgets over the medium term. And whether or not, too many questions. Okay, that answers the first part on the budget structure. Next on NIRC. All the NIRC revenues goes into the consolidated fund, and then we spend from the consolidated fund. Mr. Leong's objection appears to be some of the spending goes into these funds, the so-called endowment, the endowment and trust funds, and that these are not real spending. But that's not the case. As I have tried to explain just now, these are, most of them are drawdown funds. In some instances, like the Changi Airport Fund, we are going to spend the money quite soon when we build T5. In some cases, a bit longer, but certainly within this generation, we will be spending a lot of that money. So they will be spent, and there are good reasons why we set them aside now in order to spend and make sure that we have the resources we need for these near-term and longer-term expenditures, which will be spent. Mr. Leong says better to fund these projects through Singa. They are, I think he said, lower cost. Actually, Singa is not lower cost at all. Singa costs money. It's just Singa is a different way of financing, because for very large, long asset life projects, we think from an intergenerational equity point of view, it's better to spread it out. And so we have Singa. So we are going to do both. We're going to have real spending needs, which will be covered through these funds, and we will have projects that are funded by Singa. That's on the NIRC. And overall, if you look at the revenue moves that we have made, GST, as well as the other revenue changes, tax changes we made in this term of government, as I've explained, we are now in a good fiscal position, but it gives us the ability to move quickly and to do things for Singaporeans. Having this strong fiscal position does not come at the expense of Singaporeans. If you look at the tax burden, if you look at what we impose on taxes, relative to many other advanced economies, our tax burden is in fact quite low. And that's objective data, you just have to compare. And we intend to keep our overall tax burden low. But we will maximize effectiveness from every amount that we spend in order to make sure we maximize the benefits and outcomes for Singaporeans. Finally, thirdly, on public housing, lease decay, what's our solution? The solution is VERS. We have explained the broad outlines of VERS already, and we will provide more details in due course. On BTO flats, how do we ensure affordability? We do so by making sure that the pricing of BTO flats will be done in such a way that Singaporeans will always be able to afford. So that will make, the pricing will have to look at Singaporeans' incomes. And as I illustrated with a concrete example, the BTO price for that particular example has been updated in line with median incomes. So that will be the way we ensure that BTO and HDB will continue to be affordable. Are we worried that we are overbuilding? Here I'm a little puzzled. I thought Mr. Leong and the PSP are worried about not enough flats. And we had this debate with the Workers' Party too a few years ago about are we overbuilding and therefore we're going to have property market crash. So are we concerned about high prices, or are we concerned about the opposite? If we are concerned about high prices, then we need to build more, particularly because we have to catch up with the disruption in supply that happened during the COVID years. And that's what we are doing. We are catching up with supply. And it's because of that disruption in supply that has created that imbalance in the market. And that's exactly why we have to build more now to restore that balance. And as I said just now, we can be assured that we will be able to restore balance because HDB flats are only purchased by Singaporeans. And we will be able to build enough HDB flats for every Singaporean household. Finally, on inflation, that's the last point that Mr. Leong mentioned, and how he says the statistics are misleading. Well, or doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. But statistics are what they are. Unless Mr. Leong is accusing the Department of Statistics of not collecting CPI data properly, it may happen in other countries. It certainly doesn't happen in Singapore. We have a proper system of collecting CPI, updating the basket, the inflation basket, and the data is what it is. And I stand by the data. It has come down. There is no basis to say that GST increase has turbocharged inflation, and even the MAS itself, in its assessment, would have reflected that in its monetary policy statements.
Mr. Speaker, sir, first of all, I must commend Prime Minister for impressively answering my 10 questions. Although I have said that, one shot giving out 10 questions is unfair for the person who is replying to me. I have a few more questions arising, clarification arising from what he has replied just now. First of all, I think the difference between PSP and PAP is that I think PSP prefers to put more money into the pocket of Singaporeans. Government can reduce some expenditures, but also reduce the taxes. So my first question is, can the Prime Minister still answer my question as to what is the total amount of assets that are now being kept under the endowment and trust fund? Then next question on public housing. Can the VERS be a solution anymore? Because the lease decay itself has already set in, as demonstrated in the Ang Mo Kio SIRS case. The economics of SIRS has totally changed as a result of the lease decay. And so we have expected that the same economics will be applied to VERS. Given the economics have changed, will VERS continue to be a viable solution? Anyway, the government owes Singaporeans a clear answer. Since my housing motion, when the government promised to update us on VERS, it is more than 2 years already. And the lease decay problem has surfaced more than 7 years. Till today, there's no clear answer about lease decay. The next question, is it possible that without introducing the prime and the plus schemes, the BTO price would have already gone above $1 million? And the government is using the prime and the plus schemes to slow down the increase to $1 million, but on the other hand, increasing the deficit, the HDB deficit, which in turn increases the burden on the budget. That is something that's not sustainable. Last question. On whether the supply, the ramp up of this BTO supply now will eventually lead to an adjustment of the resale market. Actually, PSP's stance has always been, we are not in favor of just ramping up the supply. We have said in our housing motion that we should also increase the supply of quality rental flats so that this does not become a supply on the hand of owners, but it's a rental flat supply. Because if we increase the number of owners owning flats, then there will be a point where all the Singaporeans have owned flats already. And the next thing will be a downward adjustment in our HDB prices. Okay, so my last question is, will we reach a point when Singaporeans are faced with no choice but to increase our population faster to $10 million in order to arrest the decline in our HDB price?
Sir, I would disagree with Mr. Leong's characterization of the PAP government's policy as refraining or denying Singaporeans from funding or keeping the funds and not leaving it in the pockets of Singaporeans, as he put it. That's not the case at all. Whatever we collect, we put it back to benefit Singapore and Singaporeans directly. That's what the budget is about. It's not about the government holding back something. It's about making sure that all that we collect goes back to Singaporeans in different ways. Some, of course, are direct transfers, but not all of it. After all, the PSP itself says that you shouldn't do so much because this will create entitlement. So yes, some part of it goes into direct transfers, short-term measures, but a lot of it goes into a whole range of different programs which benefit Singaporeans. We are putting back the funds to benefit all Singaporeans. That is our approach. On the size of the endowment trust funds, I don't have the figures offhand. We can deal with that separately in the COS or in a separate PQ. On VERS, yes, we know that it is something outstanding, and we will provide details because the first flat for VERS is not due anytime soon, but eventually the time will come when we have to do VERS, and as we approach that date, we will certainly provide more details. The issue around plus and prime flats, let's be very clear. Why did we have to do plus and prime flats? Because for standard flats, we know that the resale market moves up and down in the near term, but we will price the BTO flats not based on resale market alone, but we look at incomes and price for affordability. So there is a subsidy there. But if we apply that same subsidy to localized popular areas, the flats will be more unaffordable. And can we make the subsidy more? Well, we can, but then you have a problem where there will be a lottery effect. People will immediately know the subsidy is greater in these popular areas. Let's go for that. And when I win the BTO, I strike lottery, right? And that's not good, that's not equitable. So the right thing to do is to have a plus and prime framework where we provide more subsidies in order to bring down the headline price, make it affordable, but at the same time, when the person sells a flat, the additional subsidies is returned to HDB. I think that's a fair and equitable way, and that's why we have the plus and prime framework. Rental flats, we want to have home ownership for all Singaporeans. That has always been a policy. That's what Singaporeans want, and I think that gives every Singaporean a stake in our nation's success. So we will continue with home ownership. It has been the foundation of Singapore society, the foundation of Singapore's success, and I think it continues to be a very important key pillar for nation building. We want to ensure a nation of homeowners, and we will continue to fine-tune and improve HDB policies to make sure that every Singaporean who wants to can own their own homes.
So he didn't really quite answer my question. So without the prime and plus scheme, do you agree that our BTO price in certain areas would have gone above the $1 million already?
That's hypothetical, I wouldn't know, but let's put it this way. When my parents bought their Marine Parade flat in the 1970s, it was $30,000 or $30,000 plus. At that time, would they ever imagine that they could sell the flat for $500,000 in the 90s? No, not at all. But why have flats gone up? It's because of incomes. It's because Singapore has succeeded. It's because our standards of living have gone up. And that progress, that success, has benefited every homeowner in Singapore. That's what home ownership provides. A concrete stake in our nation's progress. And not just that, but eventually a home and a nest egg which you can tap on for retirement. It's a sound and a key pillar of our social compact which will continue to improve and enhance and build upon.